In the last section we left off not only having our date string rendering in the page, but also set up our time to render on the page. But if you'll remember, when we reload the page, that sets our new time, but it's not counting up. Our seconds are not showing a change. So this is not a terribly great reflection for the user. All it does is tell them what time the page loaded. And so we want to make that better so that this is actually a useful clock, because if this clock just stays as it is and the page is not reloaded, the user doesn't get any useful feedback from this. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to work on using functions. So what a function does is it basically takes a collection of different expressions and it bundles them together into one group, so that it can be called by a single line rather than having to run through this entire thing, especially if you want to repeat the same process more than once. What a function does is allows you to call that same set of expressions multiple times. And what we want to do is we actually want to repeat this whole time setting multiple times. So we've got all of this, and what we want it to do is basically update the clock every second. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to do one more step here, and we're going to create a time string. And what we're going to do is we're going to just grab this chunk of text here, and we're going to set that string like this. And that does the exact same thing, but what we just did, that's called refactoring. And we're basically pulling that out to make this a little easier for ourselves when we get to the end of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new function. And the format for a function, this is going to be an unnamed function. Actually, it is going to have a name, but it's going to be function start time. And what that's going to do is that's going to get our time started out. And we're going to actually take all of this work that we did here to create this time string. And we're going to put it inside of our function. And actually, we're going to also include where we put it onto the page, because as we update our time, we're going to want our page to update regularly as well. So let's go ahead and include all of that. So now I have this function, and all this is grouping all of these things into one set. And you can see that my function is denoted by this word function, and then it's given a name, and then it has some parentheses. And if I wanted to pass in some parameters so that I could use those arguments in my expressions down here, I could. This one's not going to rely on anything else. And then I've got my curly brackets, and that wraps it. Now, one thing that I just said is that this function doesn't rely on anything else, but here we have this variable current date that is defined up here. It's defined outside of our function, and that is not a good practice to have, and this function actually doesn't really have this current date in its scope. So what we're going to do is actually set our own variable right in here. We'll just call it today, just to make it clear and easy to see the difference. So now we've got our new date and time being set to today, or we can even more accurately call it now. And this still does the exact same thing. So if I wanted to call my function, that is, I wanted to run through this. Well, actually, let's see what this does right now. So right now, if I do that, we see that this went back to 12 o'clock, and that's interesting. So let's go back to our index, and let's review. This is the static time that it's set to. So if I were to change that, you can see the JavaScript is no longer acting on my index page for the current time. And that's because what we've done is we've extracted our time process here, that everything we've done to manipulate this and set it, and we've put it inside of this function, but we haven't actually called it. So nothing is actually running through any of these things. So to call it, it's very easy. It's just start time. Okay, so that's the name of our function here. And this is us just calling it now. So we use the name, the parentheses. If we had parameters to pass in, some arguments to pass in, we would include those. And then our semicolon at the end of the line. So I've saved that. Reload. There it is. That's our current time again. Now it's still not counting our seconds. So what we need to do is we actually need to just add a timeout. So what we're going to do is add a timer that runs for 500 milliseconds, which is a half a second. And when that timer runs out, we want it to start our function, our start time function again, so that every half second it keeps running. Okay, so let's do that. Let's set a timeout that reruns start time every 1/2 second. Okay, the way we do that is we're going to just go ahead and make a constant named timeout. And there's a function called set timeout that's just part of JavaScript. If you Google it, you will find specs on it. And what we're going to do is, what we want it to do is run a function after a certain period of time. And the function we want it to run is start time. So at this point, now something inside of start time is calling itself. So this is going to create a loop. And we want it to run every 1/2 second, which is 500 milliseconds, which is the time that set timeout expects. And then we end our line with a semicolon. If I hit save and reload my page, all right, so something doesn't seem to be working here, and I wonder if you can guess what it is. Now remember, we brought in our now, which was originally named current date, and we replaced it here, but we forgot to replace it in a few other places, so that's why we're not seeing it here. So you'll find that as you write code, you're going to run into stuff like this, where you don't know what's going on, and then you're just going to need to look through your code kind of line by line and figure out where it's going wrong and what you're missing. So now that we've changed that, let's go ahead and reload this again. And there it is. Now we can see our clock running, and it's reloading every 1/2 second, or rerunning start time every 1/2 second. And so that gives us live feedback as a user. And that's all there is to it. Now we can accurately display the current date and the time. We could use that on any page with not a huge amount of code here, but enough to get the job done. And of course, there are better ways to do this, more concise ways, especially if you use plugins. There's packages already written that you could be using. But this walked us through a lot of different options, a lot of different functions that are available to us just built into JavaScript with date and all of the functions available to that, and just using constants, lets as different variable types, building strings, using numbers, using that ternary operator and the modulus operator, and the addition operator to concatenate strings. So we learned a lot of stuff in these past few videos, and hopefully you now have a working date and time clock that you can use on a web page.